May I please request everyone?
So I'll start with the national anthem kaagad.
Okay. Yeah, can you please take all your seats? We're about to start. And after asking you to sit down, may I request for you to stand up for the national anthem? You may all sit down. We're not going to pray. Good afternoon to everyone in this auditorium and to our 70 plus and growing number of participants via Zoom. Magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. We also have participants who are watching this live stream through the UP School of Economics official YouTube channel. So I would like to welcome you all to the fourth lecture of the PCED at 50 lecture series, 50 Years of Economic Policy Making. This event is presented to you by the UP School of Economics and the Philippine Center for Economic Development. I'm your host for today. I'm Marites Dangilan Vitug. I'm a journalist and author, currently editor-at-large of Rappler. 5 decades ago, on May 13, 1974, the Philippine Center for Economic Development, or PCED, was born. PCED supports the UP School of Economics in its efforts to provide quality education, training, and research that aid national economic policy making. The PCED at 50 lecture series celebrates PCED's 50 years of contribution to economic education and development. This lecture series, featuring former heads of the National Economic and Development Authority, or NEDA, began in May this year and will continue until November. So far, we've had Dr. Gerardo Sicat, Professor Solita Winnie Monsod, and Dr. Shelito Habito. Today's speaker is Dr. Felipe Medalla, and in the next months, we will have Dr. Dante Canlas, Dr. Arsenio Balisacan, and Dr. Ernesto Pernia. They will grace the rest of the lecture series. Today, we hold the fourth PCED at 50 lecture series entitled The Philippine Economy and the UPSE, Academics and Policy Making. To introduce our main speaker, may I call Dr. Francisco Daquila Jr., Deputy Governor for Monetary and Economic Sector of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas.
Magandang hapon po sa ating lahat. Today we have the privilege of hearing from one of the most brilliant economists and dedicated leaders of our time. He has devoted his career for the good of the country and to public service. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and pleasure for me to introduce our speaker for this afternoon's lecture series, Gov. Felipe M. Medalla. A seasoned economist and a prominent civil servant, Gov. Philip has recently completed his 1-year long term as Governor of the Bangko Sentral ng Pilipinas, the country's central monetary authority. All in all, he has served as a member of the Monetary Board for 12 years, having been appointed by the late former President Benigno Aquino III in 2011 and former President Rodrigo Duterte in 2017. In 2022, he was appointed as governor by President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. to serve the unexpired term of his predecessor, Department of Finance Secretary and Governor Benjamin E. Diokno. Dr. Philip's strong commitment to the 3 mandates of the BSP was clearly reflected under his leadership. On maintaining price stability, policy actions led by Gov. Philip brought inflation to a target consistent path, operationally defined as within 2 to 4%. In June, we recorded a deceleration to 5.4% from 6.1% in May. Not accounting for any supply shocks, we forecast inflation to settle within the target range by the end of the year. On maintaining financial stability, Philippine banks have delivered a solid performance under his term, as evidenced by sustained growth in assets, deposits, and profits on account of the BSP's overarching policy reform agenda. And lastly, on providing a safe, secure, and efficient payments and settlement system under the guidance of Gov. Philip, we were able to convert 42.1% of retail payments into digital in 2022. On the financial inclusion front, the launch of the Paleng QRPH Plus program is expected to simplify and modernize digital transactions. Even with just a year-long term, Gov. Philip made remarkable contributions to the BSP and to the Philippine economy as a whole. Prior to joining the Monetary Board, Gov. Philip has had an extensive experience in public service. He was appointed as the 9th Socio-Economic Planning Secretary and Director General of the NEDA under the administration of former President Joseph Estrada from 1998 to 2001. He also served as director in the boards of Metro Pacific Tollway Corporation, Asia United States, and the Philippine National Oil Corporation. Further, he is a founding member and former chairman of the Foundation for Economic Freedom, a non-governmental organization that is primarily engaged in public advocacy for fiscal reforms and market-friendly government policies. From 1994 to 1998, he served as executive director of the Philippine Economic Center for Philippine Economic Development. In 1996, he was elected president of the Philippine Economic Society. Dr. Philip is also a prominent figure in the academe. He was named dean of UPSE in 1994, where he taught from 1991 to 2001. He received his PhD in economics from Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, his master's in economics from the University of the Philippines, and his bachelor degree from De La Salle University, where he graduated cum laude. He also received the DLSAA Lasallian Achievement Award in Economics in April 2021, and the UP School of Economics Alumni Association Outstanding Alumnus Award in February of 2015. So ladies and gentlemen, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Philip Medalla, and if I can request him to proceed to the stage.
Okay, so I can manipulate from here. Okay. Saan ang page up? Okay, okay. Yeah, okay, so I can. Okay, so thank you very much, Francis. I see a lot of friends here, so I cannot greet a single individual because otherwise it will take me half the lecture. Well, initially, I wanted to talk about, well, magandang hapon sa inyo lahat. Ano? Initially, I wanted to talk about my experience when I was NEDA Director General. I will do so, but if that's all that I will do, this will be a very short speech. Because after all, I was in NEDA for only 2.5 years. And it was also right after the financial crisis where you really cannot impose taxes, you cannot do tax reforms, and not really make any major changes. So I decided that I'll do that, but do it very fairly quickly, and instead talk about, well, what I wanted to do was build on all the progress that were achieved by my predecessors. By the way, probably the most important of them is Jerry Sica. At least in my view. Okay, I like all of them, but to me, the most important was Jerry Sica. And I thought that we have to really focus on continuing the reforms that have been done by previous administration. For a mainstream economist like me, and I wear that label proudly, we can classify the reforms into two types. A is, put it roughly, stop all the stupid things you're doing, okay? The other way to call it is reforms that move away from the policies that do more harm than good because they cause market distortions and reduce efficiency and actually facilitate rent seeking without really achieving their supposed formal or official objectives. The second kind of reform is how do you improve the provision of public goods and services without sacrificing price and financial stability? By the way, that's very hard. That requires a fairly good bureaucracy. Or at least we'll have projects that can be quickly implemented if money becomes available. Under that is also, at that time, a major reform in the central bank. Because for those of you who are old enough to remember, the central bank lost a lot of money. And the reason it lost a lot of money, by the way, I wrote a little paper on that one. And the reason it lost a lot of money is that it was doing two contradictory things. It was under political pressure to finance development, which means you'll have a falling peso. Okay, you're creating too much liquidity relative to dollar supply, naturally a falling peso. On the other hand, it was very unpopular to let the peso fall. So it also had to defend the exchange rate. I actually told some people from the central bank, how can you do that? How can you create the financing that will speculate against the peso and then prevent the peso from appreciating at the same time? Of course, the entire thinking is the government will ration foreign exchange. Of course, and then borrow money, borrow dollars to sell it in the market to influence the exchange rate. Of course, when the exchange rate fell, the central bank lost a lot of money because the exchange rate at which it bought the currency, the dollars, was very, very low compared to the exchange rate when it now has to pay the debt. By the way, those of you interested in accounting, every time they lost money that way, it entered a suspense account called exchange rate stabilization account. Okay, lesson to everyone, when you see a balance sheet that has assets that are not assets, it's losing money, right? They should have just said fictitious building, okay? So, then the central bank under Jobo did the right thing, which is prevent that from getting out of control, like Latin America, he sold central bank bills that yielded 45%. Of course, that stabilized the peso and it killed a lot of banks. One of them, a bank that was stupid enough or greedy enough to put its money in real estate. And of course, very illiquid, and during bad times, falling prices. So what happens? The depositors withdrew their money to move to the 45% of Jobo bills. Of course, illiquid, and therefore bankrupt. So it also caused a banking crisis. So you can see all the problems that are related to it. By the way, when it sells 1,000 pesos worth of bills and get only 550 pesos, because these are bills that have zero coupon, what do you call the difference between 1,000 and 550? Interest, right? I think at grade 6 you're taught, right? The difference between how much you got when you borrowed and how much you paid is called interest, right? Guess what they called it? Monetary stabilization account. No, monetary adjustment account. So this one is fictitious building. This other one is birth building. Okay? So, and it came to the point that 95% of the assets of the central bank on the balance sheet side, asset side, were just those two suspense accounts. Of course, a central bank can never go bankrupt, but it will become policy bankrupt. So to the credit, you had it was embedded in the Constitution that a new central bank would be created. And I was, in fact, advising Senator Romulo on how to structure the new central bank. Unfortunately, there was a coup in the Senate. They replaced the Senate President, and I think Senator Rocco replaced Senator Romulo. But the products of the school are all over the place. The guy who was then advising Rocco was what's his name? President of PIDS? Mario Lomberte. So nandun pa rin yung school. Of course, we cannot take full credit for that because that was really the only thing to do. But I think the school did play a role as well. Okay, so this is the kind of environment that. By the way, one of the very good things that happened to us, of course, is that independent central bank. Another good thing is that central bank became an inflation targeting central bank, but that is not because of the school. It was because they were now trying new things in New Zealand and Australia, and say, let's copy. I was asked, do you like it? I said, I don't know. I don't know if it will work. What if there is inflation that has nothing to do with monetary policy? Then they'll blame the central bank for things it has not done. And then I was told, don't worry, you can explain it to the people. The difference between inflation that is the fault of the central bank and inflation that is not the fault of the central bank. I was so afraid of that I had two minds about it. But it went on anyway. And it turns out that we can actually explain to the people what really caused inflation. And they know when to blame the central bank and when not to blame it. So that's another very success story, which I think was just a result of overall changes all over the world. Okay, so now my first slide is what we did under President Estrada, continued trade and tariff reductions. By the way, the last big one of this, it turns out we will be out of office after 1 week because ERA fell. And lucky we did it, okay? I think it's almost 1,000 pages of tariff changes. Again, a little bit of story here. The Secretary of Agriculture, you can find out who he is by finding out from the internet, right? Said, well, I did not authorize that many agricultural products. I think we removed 4 pages because of that. And I said, no, your undersecretary agreed. Well, again, I will not tell you who the undersecretary is. The undersecretary was one of the faces here later on. Became NEDA Director General twice. So, and he said, no, you authorized it. And in fact, I have my notes to show it. But nonetheless, I said, okay, let's just to get it done, remove 4 pages so that we can have the full blast of liberalization as far as you can go. And luckily we did it because then we were out of office in about a week. But that, by the way, that itself is a very interesting story, but I cannot say it here because I will take up too much time. You know? By the way, the interesting story there is we were in a room strategizing and said, well, looking at the surveys, Mr. President, you're still popular, and the Vice President is more unpopular than you. So you're not going to fall unless the military will bring you down. So we asked around the room, we asked the Secretary of Defense, will there be a military coup? No. We asked the Chief of Staff of the Armed Forces? No. We asked the head of the police? No. 2 days later, 2 of them were on the other side. Okay, so those were really exciting days. But nonetheless, my point is we did a lot of things that were classic advice of academic economists. And we had the president who actually listened. Government agencies were taken out of lending. I'll talk about this later, how presence of government agencies distort the lending. Improve access of poor women to more effective family planning. I was working very closely with the late Secretary of Health, Jose Romualdez, who was very passionate about this. And of course, the Secretary of Finance, who is still a very good friend of mine. And the Secretary of Budget, then, who was still a very good friend of mine. Actually was very supportive. We stopped subsidies and guarantees to unsolicited PPPs. Although, again, a very nice story is what happened to IMSA project, the Caleria Botocan, which, again, I don't have time to discuss that. Then we took a loan from ADB, wherein one of the conditions to be met, it was, at that time, it's called a program loan. No project, but there's a loan. Later on, it was called a development policy loan. And the only condition we have the main condition we have to meet is tariffication of price. By the way, the main advisor there of agriculture are faculty members of the School of Economics. I remember Ramon Clarete. And we were able to convince the president, fortunately, because Senator Angara also agreed. He was the Secretary of Agriculture. And ERAP signed it. Again, unfortunately, by the way, the loan was called the Grain Sector Reform Law. Loan. That's wrong. That's loan, not law. Grain Sector Reform Loan. Unfortunately, when GMA took over, you had a very, very protectionist Secretary of Agriculture, and they decided not to take the remaining tranche of the loan. By the way, I think his name was Montemayor. So in other words, rice tariffication would have been a win for the School of Economics, which didn't happen. By the way, it became a win later by a simple coincidence that the Secretary of Finance was highly trusted with the President since they knew each other since they were 6 years old. So some of the reforms are beautiful because they happen because of some coincidence. And President Duterte was not from a rice-growing area. Okay, so this is a reform that happened much, much later, but it could have happened then. Okay, so I'm done with my own experience with NEDA. I can now go to other things. Okay, so But before I begin, let me give you the context. The context is Keynes. And what does Keynes say? Ideas are very important, whether right or wrong. And we underestimate their power relative to vested interests. Of course, he says, though, that I am sure that the power of vested interest is vastly exaggerated compared with the gradual encroachment of ideas. Of course, in some countries, gradual may mean a century, okay? So in that sense, Keynes was not really lying, or wrong, because he never really told you what gradual meant, And, okay, so, but the point is, ideas are powerful. Because the assumption, okay, that's the problem. When people vote for laws, they like the title, but it turns out the content is bad. And at any rate, the person also, the congressman or senator or Spencer, that still gets brownie points. So in a way, ideas are extremely important. Because sometimes the devil is in the details. Okay, but at the same time, one has to now worry about, well, if you accept, okay, so, okay, the point of Mansur Olson is individuals who are rational cannot form effective groups because they end up cheating each other, right? It's called the free rider problem. If a group has a common interest, what's the best strategy for a typical individual? Be a member of the group but don't contribute anything, right? So therefore, the larger and the more diverse the group, the more ineffective it is. And the two most ineffective large groups are called consumers and taxpayers. Everybody will kick them around, okay? On the other hand, some groups are fairly easy to organize because they're few and they have a good history of dealing with each other. And the interests around which they coalesce are fairly easy to organize. For instance, call it sugar, okay? Very sweet, no? The point is that unless there is coercion, large groups cannot get their act together, whereas small groups can get their act together. And therefore, policies will be skewed in their favor, no matter how big the loss is for the country relative to their gain. Of course, if you read American literature, American economists wonder why Americans were paying so much for sugar. Whereas the gains of the industries that benefited from the high sugar prices were much, much smaller than the losses of the consumers and the firms that would abuse the sugar. I guess that's one of the reasons chocolates we produce in Switzerland rather than America. No? So that's where we learn our politics from. No? Okay. The next one is, even if there's a gain from a reform, the losers will not be compensated for two reasons. One is the people who will package the compensation process cannot be trusted. Second is the people who do not want the reforms do not want to approve the compensation package. And one example here is Blinder, that a pro-labor policy that organized labor won't support will get nowhere politically. Okay, so he says, well, the problem is all the gains are spread out and tiny per person, but large for the entire country. No person finds it worth fighting for. Whereas the losses from liberalization will hit very, very specific groups, and they know who they are, and they will dig in. Of course, you can say, well, we can always write a compensation package for those people who were hurt by liberalization. But then if neither side if the Republican Party and Democratic Party cannot agree on the compensation package, no compensation will happen. Therefore, the reforms will not take place. In fact, he says, the gains and losses are the same, but the economic and political weights differ enormously. This is a generic and insoluble problem. Very pessimistic. Okay, so, but again, every now and then, ideas do matter. Okay, let me give you the first one. Jerry Sikat. By the way, this quotation is from my column written by Jerry, 2023. By the way, when my term as central bank governor ended, the first decision I made is I will never write a column. But, okay, so that will take away from my running in the morning. Okay, so. But he says, labor unions and the police think of promoting the welfare of our workers should look into these realities. In other words, you can have an unreasonably high minimum wage. What will happen? So there will be two types of people, those who can afford to pay it. By the way, those who can afford to pay it will pass on the increase in wages to their customers. And those who cannot afford to pay it, who will either bribe the labor inspector or just go underground, become the informal sector. So therefore, quality jobs in the corporate sector will shrink. And the economy will be largely informal, or worse, the countries, the investors in labor-intensive firms will rather produce elsewhere. So as Jerry Sikat pointed out, the minimum wages hurt because they're too high. Oops, I brought you to the end. Yeah. Okay, so that's the problem. And by the way, the Filipinos found a wonderful solution. They made, by the way, their experience was terrible when Congress and the Senate were trying to outdo each other, raising the minimum wage. That was such a large shock. And the Filipinos decided, well, at least people running the Philippine economy decided, let's depoliticize it, make the wage increases more reasonable, make it done by the regional tripartite wage and productivity board. By the way, the structure of the board is worker, employer, Department of Labor, Department of Trade of Industry, tiebreaker, NEDA. Okay? And this has worked for us for quite some time. By the way, do not take it for granted that it will always be there. Because it's very, very attractive. Raise the wages, raise the wages. After all, the firms can afford it. Yes, the firms that are still around will afford it. Okay, so I think this is one of the most important, in that sense, Jerry Sikat. By the way, Jerry Sikat has been talking about this since forever. In fact, the second PhD dissertation written in the School of Economics by Armando Armas was precisely about this. The only problem is, for those who know Mandy, he's so funny, even when he doesn't intend to be funny, that nobody believes him, okay? But he's now in Manawag, okay? So, okay, so this is the, okay, now let me talk about a reform that the school should be proud of. We raised the issue of Philippine government's credibility as a debtor has diminished so much, people think it will default. The markets think it will be default. By the way, what's the best indicator of how the market thinks it will default? Well, by the way, when I was in NEDA, then the borrowing cost of the U.S. government is 6. Our borrowing cost was 12. Okay? Look at it this way. 10-year dollar bond. Both 10 years, both dollars. The only difference is, in one case, the borrower is the U.S. government. In the other case, the borrower is the Philippine government. Same tenor, same currency, two different borrowers. So what's the cause of the difference? The difference in the credibility of the borrowers. So therefore, the gap between the borrowing, the market demands from ROP and US is a syndicator of doubts whether the Philippines can pay. And as you can see, that was as high as 600. Higher than 600 basis points was this is what kept me awake at night. By the way, this is how we convinced ERAP to borrow from the ADB, because the ADB loan was very, very low. Except the ADB says, okay, borrow, but reform NFA. For us economists, that's a fantastic opportunity. We like to borrow cheaply, right? And we want to get rid of the NFA for various reasons, no? Or make the NFA a true regulatory body, not a commercial operation. And then, as you can see, it succeeded. In fact, well, of course, it was partially disturbed by the global financial crisis, but it went as low. It went as low as just less than 180 basis points. Now, the recent events have caused it to go up, but nowhere near what it used to be. Okay, so that's a big, big win for the Philippine economy, and I think your professors in the School of Economics wrote a paper that says we are on the verge of a fiscal crisis. Increase the VAT from 10 to 12%, and the things formerly not covered by VAT, like electricity, but of course they're already covered, fuel was covered by excise taxes, please cover them. That would have been very hard to do, but a crisis says, well, what do you want? Those or these punishing interest rates that will kill the country anyway? Okay, so big win. By the way, our experience is every time we have an issue like this, we eat lunch together. And then we say, Noel, write it. Okay? And Noel, of course, is Noel de Dios, you know? And the fact that a non-political body, people like the School of Economics recommending it, gives it credibility. By the way, I got a letter from a former student. He said, why are you doing that? You're saving GMA. And I told him, the only way to save the country is save GMA. Okay, so I'm too old for a revolution. Okay, so our problem is the recent events starting from the end of 2019 has caused the debt to rise very rapidly. Large deficits. Just between 2019 and 2022, the debt has increased by 74%. On the other hand, if you start from 2016, this is shocking. We borrowed more money, the government borrowed more money between 2016 and 2022 than the rest of its history. Right? Because it took the Republic from 1948 to get you to 6 trillion pesos of debt. And in just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years, it's more than double that. There's a long story to it, which I don't have time to sell, but at any rate, this is now a big dilemma that we have to face. Now, the good news, if we grow very fast, the problem will solve itself. If revenues can grow faster than the economy, and expenditures will be slower than the economy. And the nominal growth that's required is 8.6, 9.5, 9.5, 9.7, 9.7. If inflation is 3, that requires a growth rate of more than 6%, 6.5, 7%. So 7% growth will solve it, plus some discipline. The only problem is, what if the economy doesn't grow at that rate? What if it goes back to its usual 5 to 5.5%? Okay, please raise your hand. Romy, is it 5% or 7%? Romy says 5. No? So, Okay, so this is a problem that we'll have to face, but my own view is this can be solved too, because since the fastest growing expenditure was current operating expenditures, that's where the focus of the discipline must fall. But of course, nobody wants to be the president who did not give salary increases. Okay. And be behind inflation. Okay, so this is a future issue that we must face. Okay. Well, there are many other things, I go to them very, very quickly, and I don't have charts for them. There are many things that we did that did not really do very well. The worst one was free tertiary education. I remember when we were talking about the conditional cash transfers here in this very room. Students barge in and say, not that. Free tuition. Well, of course, since parking is a problem here, I just couldn't understand why, right? Second, when you look at the people who benefit from the free tuition, tertiary education, they're much richer than those who are not in university. In other words, people who don't go to college will subsidize people who go to college. Okay. The other thing is, it's making very hard for private education to compete. And they, in many cases, use resources much more efficiently. But clearly, the school lost this debate. This is slam dunk loss, ano? Nasa kabilang side si Michael Jordan, ano? Dinangka ng School of Economics. Okay, so let me now go quickly to other things. I'll skip our paper that talk about the crisis being caused by the dictatorship. And that's why freedom is better for economic growth than dictatorship. Okay, so, I'll skip that. Okay, I'm already talking about the areas where we lost heavily. One is there was access to quality tertiary education. I already told you there were quite a bit of reforms that improved the role of government. Government financial subsidies became better targeted. That's a win. Okay. Another loss. What's another loss? Oh, population, right? Okay, it's no-brainer. The main source of new babies are women who have not finished high school and are from rural areas. In a country that could barely collect taxes and could barely spend money on education, we're multiplying the number of children and not increasing the budget. By the way, it also increases the number of votes that are for sale. I do remember my father's cousins are congressman, one was congressman, and later on governor of Mindoro. I mean, they're not perfect, but they look like saints compared to current politicians. To them, 10% is greedy. Now, 10% of the government now, okay, the other way around, no? Okay, so again, the battle for, by the way, I will just quote Ernie Pernia here. We have a soft state and a hard church. By the way, I think our position on divorce is, my wife will hate me for this, our position on divorce is stupid. We're the only country that has no divorce. So either we're the smartest country in the world or the dumbest. Okay, so these are the things that, I'll focus on the last thing because I'm out of time. Trade liberalization, the mixed bag. As I already told you, actually the level of protection for agriculture actually rose as we reduce tariffs on tradables other than agriculture. So what happens? Okay, food is expensive. And for instance, when you look at the most recent data on inflation, the headline inflation was consistently, the inflation for the bottom 30% consistently higher than the inflation for the entire country. What if I told you this? We need to protect our farmers. Let's tax the poor, urban or rural. This is the policy, right? On the other hand, suppose I told you, let's save the farmers, let's tax fuel or something else, so that we can help the poor, we can have the poor farmers without taxing the food of the poor. Because remember, when you tax food, that's 60% of the expenditure of the poor. So how in heaven's name can you justify taxing the poorest of the poor much, much more than everybody else to protect the farmers? If you truly love the farmers and still care for the poor, you'll find another source of taxes. Right? Of course, the problem is you start pointing to each other. Oh, not me, somebody else, you know? The other thing is, a compensation package is very hard to write. Even if assuming we will agree that we will have a 3 peso tax on fuel, liberalize agriculture, but have a 3 peso tax on fuel for a program for agriculture. The problem is, number one, I'm talking to people who are familiar with the Department of Agriculture, the transfer program requires a good list of farmers, farmer beneficiary list. And guess who is not in a hurry to produce that list? DA. Huh? So see, you cannot compensate, so you're stuck. The status quo, bad as it is an equilibrium. Of course, they waive all sorts of things like food security. But food security is really a bad excuse because how much of our calories is imported anyway? And second, you can have a stocking system that will protect you against food security. And you can write agreements with other countries. Okay? For instance, you can say, the Philippines is a big importer of rice. Anybody who bans rice exports to the Philippines during bad times, we will never deal with you during good times. Right? So you can write all these things. But the thing is, there's no effort to find the solution. And that's why we're stuck. Okay? The failure to find an alternative, which is find a way of helping farmers where the burden doesn't fall on the poorest among us. By the way, it has other consequence. Since food is a very important part of wages will be higher. And therefore, you cannot compete in non-tradables. Okay, my own experience, kuripot ako eh. So I bought, by the way, when I buy shirts, because I don't want to go back to the store, I buy 5, and then don't buy again for the next 3 years. So, I bought 5 shirts at Bench, and I like it because it says, proudly, buy local, and very well priced. Huh? Love local, that was the tag, love local, right here. So I came home so glad, I bought 6 of them, good for the next 3 years. Then I look at it, it's made in China. By the way, they're true, because if I bought a foreign brand, the foreign brand would have gotten the profits. So, really, the value added is bigger because Bench gets the profits rather than what? What's your favorite brand? Sara. See, so it's true, but the point is, it's already being sold here, it cannot be made here, even when the brand owner. Then if you look at shoes, Rusty Lopez, they're made in China. Of course, you should buy the Rusty Lopez because at least the premium for profits goes to a Filipino rather than a foreigner. But still, the mere fact is that our firms cannot compete in the Philippines with imports. And part of that reason is, of course, very expensive food. Of course, there are many other reasons. Now, okay, I think this is the last. And what's the result? My friend Raul Pabella calls this progeria. Shrinking manufacturing without getting rich. Okay, this is Benjamin Button, ano? He looks old, shrinking manufacturing, but he is young. Okay, by the way, when you look at employment, it's even more sad. 9% of manufacturing employment, 9% of total employment is manufacturing employment, and half of that is food processing. In other words, the probability that you meet a man on the street that he works for a manufacturing firm that is not food processing is very low. How did this happen to us? Of course, and what's the solution? Well, this is precisely all the issues. Okay, I think that's the last chart, and I said, okay, so the summary is, the School of Economics has some contribution by bringing up the issues, just as passionately as I was saying, protection of agriculture at the expense of food consumer is bad policy. Can we have a substitute for it? Small farms, old farmers. Okay, to me, this is the biggest policy contradiction of all. By the way, I call this the economics of wishful thinking. We'll have farms that are very small because we don't have primogeniture. Every generation, the farms are divided, smaller and smaller. Farms that are very small, they are so little, only the least educated will stay. So the farmers are getting old, farms are small, so no scale economies, no scope economies. Who will solve it? DA and DAR. Now, as DA and DAR solved it, if it didn't work the last 40 years, 50 years, why is it going to work now? I think it's Einstein who said, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing every time and expecting a different result. So in a sense, part of policy making is wishful thinking. And to the extent that people in academia can expose this wishful thinking, maybe we have a chance of making a little bit of difference. Now, given that our batting average is not very good, what is my advice to you? My advice to you is keep doing what you're doing, and when called to serve government, serve. Because you cannot complain that progress is not taking place when you refuse to be part of it. And then have a thick skin, okay? Because they will call you names and so on. What's the name? Neoliberal, whatever that means. Okay, so that's my advice, and I think we have a school to be proud of. It's not true that the weakness of the Philippine economy is just a sign of how bad the School of Economics is. And that's the reason I gave this speech. I wanted to counter that. My response to people who say, if the School of Economics is so good, why is the economy so bad? And my answer is, if you go by that reasoning, I will blame the sociologists for the crime rate. Okay, thank you very much, and I'm really glad to be back. Did I go too long? So what do we do next? Okay, good.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Medalla. We wish we had more time for your inside stories, bitin na bitin, and for what was happening behind the scenes, and your friendship with the Finance Secretary. To further enrich our conversation, I'd like to introduce our discussant for today, Dr. Milwida Nene Guevara. Dr. Guevara is an advocate of quality education in the Philippines. She is president and CEO of Synergia Foundation, leading several programs to make basic education accessible by, among others, promoting partnerships with local government units. Dr. Guevara is a faculty member of the Ateneo School of Government and has been working with the World Bank as member of the Civil Society Organizations Advisory Group. From 1994 to 2000, she served as Undersecretary of the Finance Department. She was part of President Fidel Ramos's economic team, leading the formulation and legislation of the Comprehensive Tax Reform Program. She was awarded the Gawad Heidi Yorak for outstanding public service. May I call Dr. Nene Guevara to the podium.
Thank you very much, Marites. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Well, I'm beginning to regret accepting this invitation because I turned out to be very optimistic in the early afternoon, but now I'm becoming more pessimistic about our future. This is the reason why the National Conference of Sinergia will not be a business conference. The theme of our conference is Neverland. And we will be Peter Pan and Wendy because the ambiance can be so frustrating and so fearful that we want really to find our Neverland. When I entered the small room this afternoon, they told me that I do not look my age. I am 75, by the way. And why do I look younger than 75? Because I don't work with the central government anymore. I work with the local governments, and I truly believe that they are really the hope for the future. Because the central government is so bureaucratic, is so rigid, is so slow, is so resistant to reforms, resistant to ideas. And I think that we should really cast our fortune on developing and finding potential local government leaders and developing them, building their capacity so that they can respond to the needs of their communities. You know, it would have been very, very important and very interesting to listen to Dr. Medalla's insights on the policy regime on the Estrada administration. I wish that we could have more discussions on the Estrada administration. I made a mistake of staying in government after the Ramos regime, thinking that a civil servant has an important role to play in institution building. I was wrong. I had a brief preview of how that regime might look like. I was called to a meeting by then President Estrada with then DBM Secretary Benjamin Jokno. We were served ginatan, halo-halo, and pansit in the revered war room of then President Ramos. President Estrada came hours late. He asked Secretary Jokno, "Ben, can you defend the budget?" And Secretary Jokno said, "Yes, Mr. President, I can." And he turned to me and he asked, "Do you have revenues to support the budget?" I had no alternative but to say yes. And the meeting was over. I could not believe that he approved the fiscal program in less than 5 minutes. Because under President Ramos, it took us months, it took us days to be able to analyze the fiscal program. The President would ask, what would be the effect of the tax reforms on equity, on the distribution of the tax burden, on inflation, on the debt burden, on GDP. And it was over for 5 minutes, no questions asked. So, and he just accepted my yes and the no of, the yes of both of us of Ben Diokno. So it would be very interesting for us to find out how were policies made during the time of President era. I surmise that a president who left policy decisions to his trusted cabinet secretaries like Philip Medalla would be an ideal scenario for a very brilliant economist like him and for the advocacies of the UP School of Economics, because there would be very little question, very little debate. Given the very limited and very biased literature which were written about that period, I would really encourage Dr. Medalla to make this important contribution. With his experience in government, Dr. Medalla would now be familiar with the benefits and limitations of academic research. Of course, they provide the data and analytic framework that support assessments of what is and what could be under the ceteris paribus concept. They help in the intelligent analysis of issues and looking at alternatives and better solutions. Quoting Dr. Medalla, I cannot agree more with what he said when he really cites the studies of the UP School of Economics playing a pivotal role in shaping policies and thinking on issues that affect the economy. But as Dr. Medalla and many of the graduates of the School of Economics who served in government must have realized, academic research has major limitations in their analysis of economic policies and programs. And I am a victim of this. Academic studies do not really have a 360-degree vision of the reasons and context which support policy decision, which can introduce bias in the conclusion of the researchers. One specific study which Dr. Medalla cites is the 2000 paper, and I will not mention who because he's one of my favorite economists, on the implications of the tax reform program that highlighted how Republic Act 8241, and I wish to underscore, had inadvertently eroded the effectiveness of the VAT system, narrowing its base. Republic Act 8241 expanded the VAT base because you must remember that in 1988, when the VAT law was introduced, it only covered goods. And of course, a larger portion of our GDP is accounted for by services. In fact, more than 50%. By excluding a very big base from the VAT became inequitable, unproductive, and distortionary. That law included the services sector under the VAT base. But this was not highlighted in that study. The study just focused on the exemptions which the VAT law gave at that time. But of course, there were reasons for the exemption. Electricity could not be included in the VAT because the prices of electricity were controlled, under price control, so the VAT could not be imposed. Also, as Dr. Medalla says, there is really no control on how Congress would mangle a tax reform. As you very well know, professionals were excluded from the VAT base because all those guys in the Senate and congressmen were lawyers, basketball players, and artists. So therefore, we really had no handle on that exemption. And that paper really just hammered on the exemptions that were granted under the VAT reform. So, with an incomplete view of the scenario that prompted the VAT reform, the study came up with a sweeping conclusion that the reform narrowed the tax base instead of looking at its purpose and its real impact. The inclusion of the services into the VAT base was a landmark reform and helped push the tax effort to 17%, an achievement of the Ramos government that has not been repeated. Of course, Dr. Medalla acknowledges and has experienced that very important parts of the recommendations are not implemented and are entrenched in the status quo. The process of policy formulation is not just influenced by the pure of hearts, by the patriots, and by those who work for the good of the community. They are influenced by politics, log rolling, horse trading, lobbying, desire to hold on to power, utang na loob, and other limitations which we are not aware of. There is no better example than the Maharlika Fund, which was endorsed by some of the very esteemed graduates of the UP School of Economics. In one congressional meeting, I uttered how I wish that the world were made up of economists. I would never say that wish again, because I now realize that economists have feet of clay and are also subject to severe limitations and can be flawed in their judgment. But I would like to end my discussion by recalling Dr. Medalla's influence on the Ramos tax reforms, which he probably forgot or he chooses to forget. The Department of Finance lobbied very hard for the replacement of the representative of the UP school and lobbied very hard that he be replaced by Dr. Medalla. We were not disappointed. Dr. Medalla was nurturing, humble, underscoring supplied, incisive, and supportive. Of course, he was always in his element, irreverent and sarcastic. For example, in the evaluation of whether we would give a different exemption level to single taxpayers, he volunteered his services together with then Deputy Commissioner Roalo in verifying if taxpayers were single and virgin. To prove his point that some incentives were redundant, such as those given on breastfeeding, he said that he does not need an incentive to be breastfed. Dr. Medalla foiled many of the attempts of Congress and others to make the fiscal program convoluted through his incisive analysis of the gross income tax. I remember he had a debate with one of the congressmen who said, "Philip, hindi mo kasi naiintindihan yan kasi hindi ka accountant." And sabi ni Philip, "Sorry, accountant po ako." He also foiled attempts to combine specific tax with ad valorem system in taxing cigarettes and beer. He also foiled attempts to grant tax incentives to catalytic industries, which was introduced by one of the graduates of the School of Economics, the introduction of a uniform rate on passive income, which was again not adopted, disallowance of interest arbitrage, withdrawal of the VAT exemption on imports by BOI firms. Unfortunately, this exemption was restored by CREATE. He brought his ideas to bear on shift from ad valorem taxation on excisable products to specific taxation. This reform has been heavily criticized by some economists from the School of Economics, noting that the reform has eroded the tax base. Again, the studies made by some of the economists were mindful of the fact that when the task force introduced the reform, it was for a single rate for cigarettes and for beer, and with an automatic indexation of the tax rates. Dr. Medalla went several steps beyond our expectations. He even attempted to participate in the committee hearings in the lower house, but opted out after one participation in the hearing. But of course, he lobbied Professor Monsod to support the tax reforms and their advocates in her columns. I joined Dr. Medalla and my colleagues for celebrating not just the studies that the School of Economics has made, but for many, not all, of the fine economists that the school produced. They were instrumental in analyzing the impact of policies and programs and recommended policies that are more efficient and equitable. My two wishes for them is to acknowledge that their conclusions are limited by access to data and desk analysis. And my wish is that they can be less judgmental by including a qualitative analysis and interviewing people who were responsible for the reforms. My other wish is that the school can write their studies in simpler language, which the public, including those who did not graduate from the UP school, can understand. For example, Dr. Medalla said that girls who produce more babies are those who did not finish high school. This can be discussed ordinarily by people and could, in fact, help us in our advocacy to help girls to be in school. So I think the UP School of Economics has an equal responsibility in fighting disinformation and revisionism. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nena Guevara. May I call Professor Medalla and Nena Guevara back to the stage, to the podium? I think we'll start by having a conversation before we open the discussion to the floor. Dr. Medalla, would you like to respond to Nena Guevara?
No, of course, I probably did not give enough time to the reforms that happened under Ramos. So, under Ramos, because clearly I did not write on that at all. By the way, I think Ramos is overrated, but he's good. He was good. And if you ask me, I'm not sure ERAP is less corrupt. Okay, so, by the way, those were words from a man I respect. So, as to ERAP making decisions very quickly, okay, let me give you an example. He asked me to give a summary of the Philippine Development Plan. It's about 300 pages. I gave him a 12-page summary and sabi niya sa akin, Philip, ang haba naman. So in a setting like that, you're serving a president that's like that, and you do your best in speaking to him in plain language. And you hope he knows you are an honest person and do not have a private agenda. And thankfully, most of the time when it came to NEDA issues, he generally respected my recommendations. Okay, let me give you an example. There was a lobby to have a regional monopolies on motor vehicle testing. By the way, some of the lobbies are even coming from embassies. And you know what I told him? If we do that, everyone who's in line for testing will be cursing you. And so what do you recommend? I said, well, anyone who wants to be in the business, be allowed to enter, provided he meets the standards. Of course, there are problems about that, but at any rate. So my point is that, okay, so he's lazy, he doesn't want to read things, but when it came to really gut issues, his instincts was in the right place, right? Indeed, we met every Monday to try to anticipate problems that may originate from people who go directly to Green Hills. So every week, the cabinet will meet and anticipate those problems. So what you got was a very unified cabinet, knowing that. After a while, he said, oh, I heard you were all meeting every Monday. I thought he would be angry. He said, can I join? Well, the problem was we were all talking about him. You know? So I said, no, we keep moving from one department to another. Oh, why don't you do meet in Malacanang so I can easily join? So what we did was meet at 7 a.m., so he never joined. You know? So the point is, regardless of his limitations, there were many things that were done right. Because the cabinet members were empowered. And I think it was an excellent cabinet. And they're all capable. Well, I'm a true believer in how good the Secretary of Labor was. He knew the problems of excessive increases in minimum wage. He says, baka naman ang yumaman lang dito, yung labor inspector. Yeah, right. So it's a good one. So I think Secretary of Health is an excellent person.
Who is this?
Benny Laguesma. Okay, so that the president does not want to read, that does not necessarily mean it's bad. It's, well, on the other hand, but I completely agree. By the way, when I appealed to Lisayon, who was very close to Joel Montes, a friend of mine. So, right after Ramos lost to Mitra in the convention, they were very depressed. But what I noticed was he was surrounded by protectionist economists, including the father of Joseph Yap. By the way, Joseph's name ends with an F. So, idol talaga ng tatay niya si Stalin. You know? So, and the problem with the old economists was where they all for too much central planning. And in my view, was the more corrupt the society, the worse central planning is. And therefore, I was for a while quite doubtful what kind of president this man will be. But then I thought, well, he's going to lose anyway. But then he won. And to my surprise, he had Joel Monte. And all of those protectionist guys were gone. And Ramos, of course, sold the country very well. So I think he was a good president. Huh?
But overrated.
Yeah. Because he was a very good salesman, right? Of course, that itself is a good quality. So, but I completely agree with Nene. Every time you do reforms, you will not recognize the baby. It starts out looking like this. And our own experience, and we were very, very aghast because we were proposing a single rate specific tax versus ad valorem. And Winnie wrote a wonderful column. He said, make Yulushutan president because he made inflation in cigarettes zero. The reason was, he created the shell companies. He sells the products from his factory to the shell companies, And since these are excise taxes, by the way, excise means the moment you take it out of an area, no more tax. It's your removal of things from the excise area that results in tax. So all you have to do is sell it to somebody at a low price, pay a low tax, and then sell it at the right price later on. Of course, you can sue him. Of course, you will always lose the case. That's the other problem. And then that's why it's right to have a single rate ad valorem. But the problem was, it was replaced by a 3 or 4-tier ad valorem rate. Specific rate. And this is the only law I know that had an attached table, a survey of prices. Of course, one particular company, all the brands are down there. And there is a provision, any new brand, the market price will be used. But you cannot run another survey without the permission of Congress. So all the tax privileges were given to the older products. Okay, so clearly what comes out was totally different from what we wanted. By the way, what scared me was when I attended all those hearings, the congressman never sent the representatives. No, never appeared and only sent the representatives. Okay, but when the hearing was about cigarettes, the room was full. And everyone was speaking. So apparently, somebody's watching. If you speak, there's a reward later on. So these are precisely the ugly part of our own democracy. So, but at the same time, as I said, so that's why sometimes you have to live with what you can get. And to me, putting fuel and electricity under VAT is actually a good thing, rather than excises. The problem with excises is they're not creditable. Whereas VAT is. So in effect, the VAT on electricity will be shouldered by the consumer, not the firm. So in that sense, the VAT is superior to excise when it came to that. And then the correct principle is VAT first, and for many products, add an excise. So I think that reform was correct, to include electricity and fuel in that. Now, of course, there are many other things that should have been taken out. Like, I am against discounts for senior citizens. There should be a limit. Because all you do is give a better life to romantic old men, right? Restaurants, plane fares. But medicine maybe you can include, but there has to be some. Of course, that one you will not touch with a 10-foot pole, because the old people all have a much higher voting rate than young people. Okay, so my point, and then I completely agree. There's no such. A lot of things you do will be imperfect, and maybe I was wrong in not giving enough credit to the Ramos reforms. But by the same token, not enough credits being given to the Cory reforms either. Okay, so, but I really thought, though, that GMA did something really terrific.
Oh.
Yeah, because we were the birds, okay? Well, imagine, the gain of the Philippine government from the lower interest rates far outweighed distortions or injustice that the VAT might have caused. Of course, if we had just kept debating and making it better and better, there would have been no law. Okay, this is the sad thing about policy reform. The enemy of the good is the perfect. You're waiting for the perfect, nothing happens. And precisely, you're right. That's why the economist should always be very conscious. When is he making a decision as an ideologue and a believer in certain things, And when is he making a decision as a technocrat? Now, I do agree that I'm quite embarrassed by the way one of our top graduates was supporting Maharlika. No?
That we have to discuss,
But
Maharlika Fund.
I would really, because of my position at that time, I wanted to stay out of the discussion, precisely because you may call me a very, very late supporter. And, well, Romy can attest to this, that I never really thought, my view was that anything that goes to the fund is additional borrowing. Because the entire country has a deficit. Even the BSP dividends. That dividend goes to the national government and it reduces the borrowings of the national government. So if those dividends goes to Maharlika, then the government has to borrow more.
So-
And then in addition, of course, Land Bank and DBP, they're buyers of government securities. If they're required to invest in the fund, they'll be lower demand for government securities. Now, government now has to find new lenders.
Were you consulted on the Maharlika Fund?
Well, I spoke out that it's something I was not in favor of, but and I also raised government. But at the same time, later on, there were a lot of changes. Like it's no longer primarily a asset management fund, but something that will be done for development strategic investments. Of course, that creates an even bigger dilemma because if you allow it to make strategic moves to matter must be large. Which means if they do good things, they'll be very impactful. If they do bad things, it will also be very impactful. So, at any rate, the law is there now, and let's see how it can be less a danger to the Philippine economy in the future.
So in this case, the UP School of Economics came late. They wrote their paper very late in the game.
Not really. It's just that the process was too fast. In fact, my impression was the president himself was not sold on the idea before, when he's already known he was elected, but not yet in office. At that point, he was not really sold on the idea yet. So to me, the curious thing is what happened between that and that.
So whose idea was it?
I really don't know.
I think we can open the floor for questions. For those who want to ask, please go to the microphones at the middle of the aisle and identify yourself and your affiliation, and please go straight to the point. Preambles are discouraged.
Good afternoon.
And please say to whom you're addressing the question.
Good afternoon. Hello. Hello. Hello, hello. Yeah. Yes, Alex Escucha. My question is for Philip, of course, but I would like to 100% second the motion of Ma'am Nene that you should write your memoirs.
It will hurt. So I won't.
On three basic points, no? One is what were a really more realistic assessment of what were the unrealized real accomplishments of the Estrada administration, because there were some good things that happened. Number two, what mistakes were made, and number three, what opportunities would have been missed, or if you had to do it all over again, what would you have done better? The second major argument for that is, I don't want you to lose out by default with the tell-all memoirs of Aprodisio Lakian na parang the midnight cabinet is this, overriding the formal cabinet, what was really the dynamics there. I think you have a better story to tell than Prod Lakian.
Okay, let me say something about Prod Lakian. the day he came, we were already betting how many months he'll last. Because he sounded like a man who's totally ungrounded. Okay, let me give you an example. There was a meeting, and there were people there other than the cabinet members. He said, well, I brought my wife along because she's willing to serve for free. He will help me. So when you hired me, you're hiring my wife as well. And then he said, Mr. President, my one and only wife. Di patay na, di ba? Then he said, I want to take over PIDS. When he met Secretary Romualdez, gave him a lot of advice on how to run the OH on the first meeting. And then he met the Secretary of Transportation and also gave them the same advice. So we already betting, we had a pool. This guy will last 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. And he wanted to make himself look greater than he was. No, maybe Aphrodisio is the right name for him. Okay, now, on the other hand, I think the cabinet really got their act together and prevented any major problem. And things were moving. The problem is we did not have a Department of Wetting. We should have watched that part, you know? So, we did not have a department that watched the release of tobacco money. But by and large, my own experience with ERAP is when the money is already inside government, he really wanted to make sure that it's spent well. Now, the fact that anything longer than 3 pages he doesn't want to read, then you have to adjust. I read that Reagan was like that too. So I don't think we should judge a president by these external things. You have to judge him by what has been done. And what's very, very clear is he pushed through with liberalization. He was, by and large, a very market-friendly president. Of course, so was Ramos, right? So, and then my own view is that for money already inside government, there was less corruption under ERA than before and after him.
So
of course, that's of course very hard to measure, right? So to begin with, he did not have a first gentleman, right? Okay, and he did not have an MBA.
What's an MBA?
Baby,
Okay,
so
but he had 3.
MBA. Yeah, but the nice thing about having 3 is no one has influence.
Oh, diversified pressure.
No, because there's so many, you don't talk to anyone, right? So, and there was no pressure to talk to anyone. So I really don't think Arab was more corrupt than the people before him or after him. And I wish there was no coup d'etat. Because the removal was a coup d'etat. If we had not removed him and just jailed him afterwards, our history would have been very different. There would have been no GMA, no Pinoy, and no Duterte. And maybe no FF Jr., right? We never know. So if you are seeing a movie like Back to the Future, and you could change it, that was the alternative future for me. That removing the president extra-constitutionally was a terrible thing. The rule said not enough votes, not convicted, not removed. And resorting to military, of course I can understand the military because they Later on, I found out that the reason Arab had no choice but to move out was that even in the PSG, maybe 80% was already on the other side, which left him no choice. And I think the military also wisely decided that, divided as they are, they should not shoot each other. And they decided to meet and say, well, okay, let's agree on the rules. Majority, the other side will follow. And then the majority said, let's remove him. Of course, by the way, the same thing could have happened to GMA after Hello Garci. But even only De Castro was afraid of himself becoming president. As our friend, what's his name, Congressman from Bicol? Joey. She was one lucky bitch. No? That's what she said. So the point is, it's okay. Academics have two choices: stay like academics and stay out of policy making, and therefore work on relatively esoteric topics, or dive into the swimming pool, and where you know that somebody is too lazy to go back to the toilet and still there, right? So, and you hope the chlorine will save you, right? But this is the fact of life that everyone must realize. How much faith do you have in your own values and your own integrity? Of course, from my point of view, I'm not necessarily a better man than most people, but one advantage I have is I don't care for material things.
So that's stuff for your memoir, as was suggested by...
The thing is, every day you ask yourself, is this time to resign? Is this the day I resign?
During the Estrada years or Marcos years?
No. I think every academic in government should ask himself that question, is this the day I should resign? Now, if you decide to say, I'm not resigning, it's because you're a bit conceited. That the guy who will replace me will be worse. Right? So, but that's the thing. I think you enter with eyes open and be able to play with the players without being part of the game in many other ways. Now, the other option is stay out. And by the way, if you're wealthy and do not like a difficult life, that may be a good choice. But my advice, though, is it's hard to be complaining about what's happening to the country when if you are called to serve, you refuse to be part of it. Of course, Nene is right. All of the problems you will encounter, both ethical and moral, and the extent to which you are myself, you may be wrong as well, right? So the question you ask is, but there is a very difficult question: is the country better off if somebody else? By the way, when I was about to step down, I called the president that I was stepping down already. And he said, why? Because at this point, Mr. President, I cannot work with anybody anymore. And you might as well replace me by a post office box. So I think, I think because of all these external appearances, people demonize Era, but I don't think he's any worse than in terms of corruption, I don't think he's any worse. But we have to give credit to GMA for making the very difficult decision. right? The country is on the verge of defaulting because interest rates are getting higher. By the way, this is self-fulfilling prophecy. If the markets think you will default, interest rates will rise. You're too risky. But if interest rates will rise, you cannot afford it anymore, you will default. So you have to act quickly and decisively, as she did. But when I read about stories about corruption from the first gentleman and so on. By the way, this one, I hope Cesar Buenaventura, I think we attended the meeting. I was attending the Makati Business Club. Cesar Buenaventura saw me. This was after my era fell already. He said, you know, Philip, compared to her in GMA, your boss looks like a pickpocket. This was not me, huh? No, but at the same time, she has to get credit for getting us out of that mess, which is on the verge of default. And the School of Economics, this is probably one of the few times where it really made a big difference. And as I said, in an area where it's supposed to be its core strength, which is tuition policy, it could not even win. Right? So these are, now, very disappointing, but okay, so you decide whether you will join or not. And by the way, Carl, I'm glad you joined, right? So you.
I think we have time for.
Sorry. I'm sorry, I went too long.
No. In fact, it is. This is recorded, I think so. No, I think.
So the bitch will be mad at me.
No, I think for posterity, for the school. I'm just speculating. So I think we have a question from the floor.
Hello. I am Tyron Luzon from Central Escolar University's Political Science Society. For my question, first I would like to mention that last time when Dr. Gerardo Sicat was here, I asked the question on high minimum wages. As you mentioned, that if we had to put up higher minimum wages, business owners would suffer because they would not have enough funds to give salaries for their employees. Kung sabihin nga natin, kung wala naman akong pera, paano ko naman isasweldo ang manggagawa ko? So, if we were to tax certain goods, it would have its pros and cons. For example, if we tax fuel or gas, transporting goods would be more expensive for the food going to certain areas. So, to believe that there is a certain solution that I would like to ask you, I believe that urging the national government on creating changes would be a hassle, as it is not easy to put out ideas in that branch. So, since it is difficult, should we make policies in local governments on investing in local businesses and farms that would be beneficial not only for local cities and municipalities, but also the national spectrum or nationwide? I would agree with Dr. Guevara because in the city of Imus, where I live, since historically it is a hacienda, a massive agricultural area, for years of development, it has become a staggering agriculture to an industrial sector. So, since the past Maliksi administration, poor governance has been seen since the development of Imus was not seen easily by the people. So, again, going back with the question, should we invest more on our local governments and municipalities?
Okay, I don't want to comment on Imus because my father-in-law is very close to the Remulias. Okay, but in general, in a sense, you get the government that you deserve. So if the local government does good work, then autonomy is good. Of course, you know very well, no, the exact opposite. The solution is to kill your rivals because you don't want them to get into your gambling and other businesses. That's, I think, the Digamo Tebe story. Okay, so of course the worst of all was Ampatuan, which is he's stealing all the money, and he doesn't want to be replaced. He said, "I'll kill anybody who files a candidacy." So this is the problem with local governments. The assumption is that there's no violence. But what if the local government is itself the source of violence? And therefore, it will be very entrenched. Okay, so in the old days, the solution was the town was put under PC control. Okay, because supposedly Badas, but at that time, at least the reputation, the constabulary, I think was much higher in the PNP now. Okay, so in other words, the LGUs are a double-edged sword. You know? If you get good ones, they can do lots of good things. You get bad ones, they make the national government look good. Okay, so and to the extent that they can intimidate, and they have private armies, the moment they win, they'll never lose. So these are the things that we have to think about. Now, on the other hand, you're asking a question about taxes. You're right, taxes hurt. But governments that do not have money or governments that are in danger of defaulting do more harm than good than those taxes. Okay, so that's now, of course, the difficult part is if you have already imposed a lot of taxes and the debt's still high, what do you do? And this is the current problem. The easy taxes are gone. Because it's one thing to go from 10% back to 12. It's another thing to go from 12 to 14. So I think this is my worry that relatively easy taxes are not available anymore. When you start thinking taxing junk food, you really scraping the bottom. And that's why I think the only solution is some control over current expenditures, and hopefully the really good stuff is the last to be cut. Okay, so it's difficult, but at the same time, the way we elect people is too expensive. I talked to a congressman. It takes what? $5 million to become congressman? Some cases. $2 million. So if somebody spends $2 million, $3 million, $4 million to become congressman, there are only two possibilities. One is a very good man and he wants to help society. The other one is he will get his money back. No? So in that setting, quality of spending will clearly deteriorate. And what scares me is there are now what? There are now 29 deputy speakers.
No, reduced.
Huh?
Much reduced.
Ilan na kayo?
Baka 5. During Duterte's time, there were...
Over to 29? Yeah, there was a time that
that was Duterte's time.
29 deputy speakers. So clearly, we have to... Okay, you say, well, we hope people don't sell votes so that winning, it will not be too expensive to get elected. But unless we can change that, we are in a low-level equilibrium because it's optimal to buy votes and it's also optimal to sell votes. The reason is they're all assholes, so at least the asshole who shares is better. No? So it's optimal to sell votes. No? So you want to get out of those low-level equilibriums, and I don't know, how do you make it cheaper so that ordinary people like Nene can be congresswoman?
Sir.
Right? But right now, it's so prohibitively expensive. So we have to ask ourselves this question too. But, okay, so the problem is, if you pass a law that limits spending, they will just violate it anyway, because you cannot check. But this is, by the way, this is where I blame the Catholic Church. Because the people having children are those who have not finished high school. You're increasing the rate of growth of boats that are for sale is faster than the rate of growth of boats that are not for sale. Of course, the solution itself is to have rapid progress, which will remove the need to sell boats. But with your corruption, it's very hard to have rapid progress, right? So this is the class. By the way, this is why they call economics a dismal science. Most of the conclusions are very dismal. Again, this point. Individually rational human beings cannot act efficiently and rationally as a group. And the question there is, what are the reforms and institutions that are necessary for that to happen? And the very first answer is, those who commit corruption should go to jail. Chicago used to be run by Al Capone. Okay, so the question is, okay, of course, in the case of the Philippines, if we wait long enough, given our own talent and the eventual drop of birth rates, we will be a middle-income country and the quality of boats will improve. When will that happen? Well, my father died at 91, so I might still see it.
Okay, on that optimistic note, from assholes to church to seeing the country rise to a upper middle income country.
But enough people are middle income.
Okay.
Not just the average.
So on that note, I'm sorry we don't have.
Can I just say something?
Okay, please get your.
I will use your term, overrated. I think you overrate the reform of GMA very much. You know, she created the fiscal crisis herself, you know, because of very bad governance, because she refused to increase power rates, she refused to increase water rates, and the corruption. So I think the fiscal crisis was really begun by her. So, you know, there are alternatives to raising the VAT rate to 12%. Because Thailand, in fact, lowered the VAT rate to 7.5 and did not encounter the fiscal crisis that you were so afraid of. I think if you think Ramos is overrated, Gloria is overrated 100 times more.
But by the way, I'm not a fan of GMA. And I think there's something different between us and the Thais. What worked in Thailand did not work here. No? But so the point is, okay, so, by the way, if she had not called Garci, things would have been much better. That was the big mistake. And the problem is with her voice, she did not need any experts. Right? So she was, that was karma, to have her voice and to her to make a call. Right? So, when your Hello Garci becomes used as something for when the phone rings, I was attending a mass and then the guy sitting at the phone ring, Hello Garci, you are in trouble. But all of those things that happen to our poor country. Okay.
Okay, thank you so much. Wait, I think the next speaker was a GMA NEDA head, right? Dr. Canlas? Yes. So he will have a lot to answer for. Anyway, thank you very much to Dr. Guevara, to Dr. Medalla. And can you please stay? So may I call on Dean Abrenica and the chair of the UPSE, Carl? handok. They're going to give you a token of appreciation.
Maybe I said too much.
No, can I just say a few words about the gift? It's a painting by Francis Evangelista. It's called Between the Lines. It is part of Francis' latest collection called Hues and Hymns. He is known for his abstract renditions of the natural environment. That is the painting. And he hails from Rizal, home to many of our known artists, and he likes to reconnect us to the natural elements of our world. So that's for you. Oo nga. On the screen, you can see the painting. So just a few more announcements. Okay. Those who were not able to raise their questions can still send them to this email address, upse.upd@up.edu.ph, and I think they will be forwarded to you. And also some other announcements. The schedule for the next, so Dr. Dante Canlas, I think there will be a full house because that's 9 years. I think did he spend 9 years in NEDA? Okay. And then Dr. Balisacan and then Dr. Pernia will be the last one. And the the PCED is also conducting a survey, a feedback. So if you have forms on your table, you can please fill up the survey forms. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon. And snacks and refreshments will be served.